how should I think about dividends from US shares versus Australian shares? They seem very different. Well, that's a great question because as a general rule, US companies, US ETFs will pay less dividends than Australian companies and ETFs. If I'm not mistaken, Dave, I think that's mostly just because like with the existence of the franking credit system, Australian companies find it more appealing, right? So it's in a way, it's like the tax system that's set up encourages Australian companies to pay out more, which is why they do. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, pretty much. I suppose it's pretty much driven by the tax system. So a company in Australia earns money, pays tax, pays you a dividend, and then because they pay tax, generates franking credits. If they don't pass them on to you, they're effectively useless to the company. So they basically are always going to pass them on to you. And because the generation of franking credits comes when a company pays tax and makes money, there's an incentive there to pass on more of their earnings as dividends because all of their taxed earnings have generated franking credits, right? So because those franking credits aren't really useful to the company, but they are useful to the shareholder because it helps reduce tax on the dividends that get received versus if that same dividend didn't come with the franking credit, then it makes sense for the company to then pass on more of its earnings because those franking credits aren't very useful to the company, but they are to the shareholder. So you end up having shareholders kind of pushing for more and more dividends. So what tends to happen is US companies will pay out a much lower proportion of their earnings as dividends, and in Australia they'll pay out a much higher proportion of their earnings as dividends. And so what tends to happen is that US companies instead, they'll pay out maybe something like 30 to somewhere between 30 to 50%, I believe, of their earnings as dividends. Whereas in Australia, it's more like 70%, sometimes a bit higher than that in their earnings as dividends. So what tends to happen is the US companies will actually just use that extra money to grow the company, whether it's investing in new technology or new people, or they'll even use some of that money to buy back their own shares, which essentially has the outcome of boosting earnings per share. And in turn, that's partly what leads to the higher capital growth of US shares. So that's a little explainer about why the dividends are different in the different countries.